Someone handed me a secret recording.
We've got to get rid of all those loose ends, okay?
For years now, I've been investigating this guy.
What, you stab her in the neck with a knife?
He's known as Mr. Big. His tentacles spread to the very heart of the justice system.
I don't just need it under the carpet, I need it to be fixed.
I'm Alicia Bridges. I find out who he really is in Mr. Big, a new true crime podcast from Unravel. Search for Unravel now on the ABC Listen app.
ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
Ask yourself, what's more likely? I'm ABC investigative reporter Rachael Brown.
And I'm Stephen Stockwell. It is Friday the 20th of June. We have just finished the 8th week of this trial. Welcome to Mushroom Case Daily.
The small town mystery that's gripped the nation and made headlines around the world.
On the menu was beef Wellington, a pastry filled with beef and a pate made of mushrooms.
At the heart of this case will be the jury's interpretation of Erin Patterson's intentions.
Erin Patterson has strongly maintained her innocence.
It's a tragedy what's happened. I love them.
Rach, this week we have had two versions of a story told to the jury in Erin Patterson's triple murder trial. We have had the prosecution laying out what they say has happened, what the evidence should point the jury to, an image of a woman who should be found guilty, in their words, of murder. And then we've had the defence's version, which paints a very different picture of what they believe has happened, what the evidence points to, what the evidence doesn't point to, I suppose, maybe a stronger way of doing that. All of the closing arguments, the kind of moments that pull together the threads of the evidence over the course of the 8 weeks of this trial. We've spoken about this so much, this kind of like, that we didn't know where they were going to be going with a lot of these stories until this moment.
Yeah, both of them dropping lots of seeds along the way. Colin Mandy SC doing it in a way that he cross-examined certain witnesses. The prosecutor, Dr. Nanette Rogers SC, laying groundwork with certain witnesses that she would return to later with others.
Yeah, there's been so much that has happened over the last 5 days of this trial, such big moments, and there's a lot that we're going to get to in this episode. I want to wrap up kind of the main threads of this week. The court hasn't sat today. It's been a day off. Justice Beale yesterday letting the jury know that they'll have Friday and Monday off as he works in his judge's charge. So we have decided to make our way into our studio anyway, just to give you this wrap, because there's a few things, again, that I want to wrap up, hitting a few points around the kind of like the dueling motives or the motive and the anti-motive, some of the timelines that have been spelt out by the prosecution and also countered by the defence. Also, importantly, how Erin Patterson was as she was kind of sitting in the room hearing this evidence or hearing these arguments presented about her. There's so much I want to get through, Rach, but I think to start it, one of the threads I didn't expect to hear this week, or I didn't expect to kind of come up, was this idea of empathy and what the jury should do with that.
Yeah, this is a really important one, Stocky. You and I have spoken a bit about this over the course of this series, that the courtroom is really no place for feeling. And unfortunately, we're humans, we're not robots. It's inevitable, but especially in a courtroom. The jury will be told this during the charge, but we've already started to hear a bit of this from the prosecutor and the defence barrister, is, you need to put aside sympathy or bias. Dr. Nanette Rogers SC told the jury, don't let your emotional response to these allegations cloud your judgment. Don't feel sorry for the accused, but also don't have any bias against her. You mightn't want to believe that anyone is capable of acts like this, that they're too horrible and cold and beyond comprehension. But Nanette Rogers SC said, push all that aside, that this is not the place for that.
Yeah, it was interesting, as you're talking through there about what Nanette Rogers was saying, she did this whole thing about a jigsaw. We spoke about that earlier this week and also on our Thursday episode yesterday, about how there's this kind of like bigger picture they need to look at, take out the individual pieces and just look at the big picture of what the evidence points you towards. Don't let your emotion kind of lean you one way or the other.
That's true. And she said, if you get stuck on a particular piece, just, leave it essentially and step back and look at the bigger picture. I mentioned the other day it gave me the idea of an impressionist painting. You know, up close it's a real mess. Apologies, Manet and Monet and all of them, but you need to step back to get an appreciation of what the picture actually is.
Yeah.
Colin Mandy SC told the jury along the same lines to do that also.
It was interesting, Nanette Rogers kind of going on this whole line about, don't let the sympathy or bias influence you in this. This is towards the end of her, her closing address, I think, on Tuesday morning. And then shortly after this, Colin Mandy SC, the defence barrister, gets up, kind of goes again straight into this whole empathy vibe, where they should be, where they should be thinking, what they should be thinking with, I think is kind of what they want the jury doing.
Colin Mandy earlier in the week also made the point that, you need to put aside sympathy and prejudice. And he spoke what I think was touched on at the beginning, but hasn't really been returned to since, because of the fact, as I just said, a courtroom is no place for feelings. But he called it out earlier this week, and he said 3 people died and 1 very nearly died, and that's Ian Wilkinson, who's been there most days of this trial, Stocky.
Yep.
And Colin Mandy said it's a terrible tragedy for those people and their families and everyone who knew them. Yep. There's no escaping that. Ian Wilkinson is a good and a kind person. And there's every reason to believe that Don and Gail and Heather were as well. And they were good to Erin Patterson and her family. He called it out. He said there's been a lot of sadness in this courtroom, and God, we've watched it. There has been. And he said they're still grieving their losses, and it's a natural response to be moved by that, he told the jury. And it's natural to feel like whoever caused their deaths must be held to account. But he said this is no place for retribution nor revenge. And, you need to kind of put aside what's in your hearts, because that has no bearing on the facts. And I think that will form, as it does with most judges' charges that I've heard in the past, that will form a cornerstone of what Justice Beale will tell the jury next week when he gives his charge, that they need to use their heads and not their hearts.
Yeah. Speaking of heads, I'm drawn to something that I was thinking about a lot this week around memory, a line that Dr. Rogers brought up in her closing, talking about the memory and the recollections of the accused Erin Patterson. This was, I think, in relation to talking about the Asian grocers, talking about how at times Erin Patterson had this incredible sort of forensic memory, pointing to a moment where she said a certain date was a Monday, and it was corrected by Erin Patterson saying, no, that day was a Friday, kind of highlighting that moment. Some of the other moments where Erin Patterson was very particular about the recollections of others and what she had told people. And then saying, well, there's other times as well, though, where, you'd notice that Erin Patterson has not been very specific, not being able to recall certain details, particularly around the Asian grocers that she says she sourced mushrooms from in the lead up to the lunch.
Yeah, and not remembering the shop that she bought them from, even though she could remember the packaging and things like that. Dr. Rogers was very clear in trying to call her out on some of those instances. In regards to the specificity we've spoken about a lot, it was interesting that Erin Patterson's last words in the witness box was, maybe I was being pedantic. I do that.
Yeah. Something that, Colin Mandy SC referred to in the final moments of his closings yesterday, talking about, how Erin Patterson had subjected herself to cross-examination. She didn't need to take the witness box, stand in the witness box. She chose to, and she answered those questions, and was he said very detailed in her responses, which is I guess another lens of which you can look at someone being pedantic.
And stood up to very rapid fire questioning from a very good barrister, which was out of respect to Dr. Rogers. They've all worked very hard on this case, and it's not something, Stocky, that we see in every trial. The onus is on the prosecution, not the defence. There's no adverse response to be gleaned if the accused doesn't take the witness stand, but Erin Patterson did. And Colin Mandy told the jury, he says that she got through that unscathed despite 8 days in the witness box. Yep. Dr. Rogers might have different feelings on that, obviously, but that's what Colin Mandy told the jury.
Yeah. One of the other themes, we talked about empathy a bit. The other theme was the idea of intent around the alleged crimes that we're talking about here. The prosecution has not presented a motive for why Erin Patterson would have, they say, murdered the people that came to her lunch and attempted to murder Ian Wilkinson, who was the lunch guest who survived that. A lot of conversation around the fact that there is no motive, and despite that, spending a lot of the prosecution outlining a lot about the relationships of Erin Patterson, particularly with the lunch guests and her estranged husband Simon Patterson, kind of pointing to some of the tension that was present there at times.
And the prosecution knows that motive is not one of the elements of murder. It doesn't need to prove motive. But we have heard stories that the prosecution has put forward about animosity within the family. We've heard about Erin Patterson feeling isolated and, a bit of an outsider when she was left off the party list for Gail's 70th birthday. We've heard about the fight that she was having with her estranged husband, Simon Patterson, over child support payments, the dispute when he listed himself as single on a tax return, which started that whole saga, and the frustration that Erin was feeling when Simon's parents, Don and Gail Patterson, refused to intervene, and that's what took us to the evidence from the Facebook friends, the eye roll emojis. I want to take you to, we've spoken a bit about them, but two of the main messages, the anger that the prosecution says Erin Patterson felt towards her mother and father-in-law. She says in one of the messages, and this was on the 6th of December, 2022, Simon's dad contacted me this morning. He said, we can't adjudicate if we don't know both sides, and Simon won't give his. And then he said he'd pray for Erin, and that elicited her response. Language warning here. This family, I swear to fucking God. And another one on that same day. Nobody listens to me. At least I know they're a lost cause. I'm sick of this shit. I want nothing to do with them.
And we spent so much time, Rach, on those Facebook messages. That was a big part of what the prosecution was talking about, to show what they say is this frustration that Erin Patterson had with the extended Patterson family, with with certainly Don and Gail Patterson that have come to the lunch. It's Don who she's talking about in those messages. We also heard evidence about her frustrations with her estranged husband, Simon Patterson, again, particularly about those kind of like the child support payments. Also, his sort of disputes, I guess, around who should be paying for medical care as well for her children at certain point, or their children, I should say, at certain points. And so, the prosecution was making, kind of painting a picture of a duplicitous Erin Patterson, a woman who, kind of presented herself to the Patterson family as someone who was caring and loved them and wanted to be a part of it, and then who, the other side of her other face potentially, to these Facebook groups, to her Facebook friends, as this woman who was frustrated and didn't like them and had a frustration with the kind of the whole situation. That's
right, but the defence, on the other hand, has said, prosecution, you've said you don't need a motive, but then you've spent so long on all these messages and so long on stories about this family imploding to try to, scratch around and try to present some form of a motive so that the jury can factor that into their intent deliberations. The defence's line was very different. The defense put up this idea of an anti-motive. And so, asked the jury, does an absence of motive make it more likely that this was an accident? What's more likely, that she wanted to kill everybody or she wanted to reconnect with everyone for the sake of the children? And the elements within that anti-motive, as Colin Mandy SC put it, and I'll quickly run you through some of them. She put Simon Patterson on the property title for Mount Waverley and Leongatha long after they were separated. She was treating their assets as joint assets. She gave his siblings loans. Even Simon Patterson, the defence said under examination in this trial, money was not a strong motivating factor for her. We heard about the relationship closeness between Erin Patterson and Don Patterson, how Don Patterson tutored her son. We saw a video of them doing a science experiment together.
There's all of these things that the defence was presenting to basically go, look, this woman has a motive, if anything, to keep these people alive.
Yeah, exactly. Colin Mandy SC said that there's no doubt there was a great relationship that Don and Gail had with Erin and Simon's children. There's no doubt Erin was devoted to her children. So why would she take active, loving grandparents away from the children?
When the prosecution was presenting its case earlier in the week, I guess, so not case. It's been presenting its case for 8 weeks now. When it was kind of running through its closings, Dr. Annette Rogers SC, one of the moments that has stuck with me was the way that Dr. Rogers spelt out the timelines following the lunch. We've heard so much about the medical states of all of the people who attended the lunch, who got sick, when, how sick they got. We've seen records from people. We've heard, there were dozens and dozens of medical professionals that came before the court and gave evidence. And as we were talking about at the start of this episode, this is the moment where everything kind of gets tied up into, a much more coherent structure. As they're working through evidence, they're not explaining why they're doing things in certain ways. They're just presenting this stuff to the court. And then in the closing, it's all spelt out. And Dr. Annette Rogers, kind of put in context the timelines of when people were getting sick. As Erin Patterson saying that she was getting sick in the afternoon following the lunch, while the other guests weren't getting sick until, overnight, until the following day. The following day when Erin Patterson is, driving to her son to a flying lesson, the other guests are being taken to hospital. On the Monday when Erin Patterson is taking herself to hospital, the lunch guests are being prepared to be transferred to much different hospitals, much better resource hospitals, because their conditions were deteriorating so quickly, really putting in context the difference in their experience.
That's right. And when Annette Rogers SC was saying these examples to the jury, I was reminded of, remember that show 24 and the split screen and things that are happening at exactly the same time? This bit of the evidence acted as this very visceral juxtaposition for me about where people's illnesses were at.
Yeah, I could almost imagine, Erin Patterson, a little screen, right, of Erin Patterson driving, from the hospital to prepare her house after being told that she needed to be admitted and she wasn't ready, to another screen of, the Wilkinsons in their hospital bed, barely able to lift their heads.
That's right. So when she's signing the discharge form at Lee and Gather Hospital early, we're talking about 8 a.m., having driven her two children to the bus stop before that, this is at a time that Ian Wilkinson is particularly unwell. He's not moving around that much. Heather is shuffling back and forward to the bathroom.
And this is the Monday following the lunch?
That's right. This is Monday the 31st of July. That afternoon, Don Patterson, he's critically ill in multiple organ failure. He has a tube down his lymph pipe. And this is at the time that Erin Patterson is being transported by ambulance to Monash Hospital, and one of the paramedics described her as calm and chatty. We moved to the next day. All 4 lunch guests are conveyed to the Austin Hospital ICU on life support, all in varying stages, but all advanced stages of multiple organ failure. And this is the day that Erin Patterson is discharged with no clinical or biochemical evidence of amanita poisoning and no liver damage.
Yeah. As well as the prosecution's kind of, timeline as well, we had Colin Mandy SC, the defence barristers, like his timeline, his explanation for why things were happening at different times. And he pointed us to Erin Patterson's history of binging and purging, which we heard about during her evidence, and that she had binge eaten following the lunch. There was an orange cake that had been left over by the guests, and then following that, sometime closer to kind of 3 p.m., 2:45 p.m. than dinner time, she purges that, so emptying the contents of her stomach. Colin Mandy alluding to the fact, not directly in any evidence, because we didn't see any evidence that would reduce the toxicity of this, but saying that, you could assume that would reduce the toxicity of it, planting a seed in the jury's mind as to why Erin Patterson may not have been as sick as the other lunch guests. And then also talking about, in the timelines, Erin Patterson getting sick before the other guests, Colin Mandy saying, well, look, she was preparing this mushroom duxelle, and after she had added the other mushrooms to this, you could assume that she would have tasted that, she would have tried that, and, therefore potentially ingesting some of the poison, getting sick earlier than the lunch guests.
That's right. He said that's the reason she added the dried mushrooms in the first place, to balance out the flavours, to make it more flavoursome and less bland. So he says you'd assume that she would have tasted it after she added the dried mushrooms.
We should say that we haven't heard any evidence from Erin Patterson directly that she did taste the duxelle. We heard that she tasted it before, but she didn't say that she had tasted it after that point.
That's right. And the other thing that we didn't hear was from experts on how soon that would have to happen to affect the absorption rate. But Colin Mandy SC said to the jury, obviously, if you've thrown up after a lunch, that will affect to some extent the absorption, but as I said, we didn't hear from any experts on that. We did hear from Dimmitri Jerus from the Victorian Institute of Forensic Medicine that sometimes people can have the same meal and have differing severity in the symptoms, that one person might have grade 1, which was gastrointestinal issues, and other people might have very significant worse grade effects on your liver and your kidneys and things like that.
Yeah, and that's something that Colin Mandy, we spoke about this in our episode on Thursday, Colin Mandy making the point that, some of these questions weren't asked to some of the witnesses who gave evidence. Interesting that, this evidence was presented by Erin Patterson after these people had given evidence earlier in the trial. This wasn't anything that the prosecution had been aware of at that point. Something that the prosecution made another kind of a big point of covering was the way that Erin Patterson acted following the lunch, kind of painting a picture of someone who was trying to cover her tracks, basically. Saying that, when she got to the hospital on the Monday following the lunch, death cap mushrooms were mentioned to her quite early on. And the prosecution says this is the moment that she realised that her ploy had been uncovered, that her plan had been uncovered. And at that point, she started trying to make plans to cover her tracks, basically. So, they're saying that this involves the dumping of the dehydrator, which she did on the Wednesday, I think, following the lunch, after she was released from hospital. It involves some of the lies that she told people around, the source, or not foraging for mushrooms at that time, not saying that potentially there were death cap mushrooms in that meal, once she says that she realised when she was in hospital that, that could have happened. And then also the way she has presented her phones. We've heard about a couple of phones in here, particularly phone A, which is what the prosecution says is the phone that Erin Patterson was using in the year kind of the 8 months leading up to the lunch, a phone that was never recovered, a phone that when the police came to her house to kind of get from her, she gave them a separate phone, a phone that's called phone B.
A dummy phone, the prosecution calls it. So I won't go into the intricate detail of all the phones and all the SIMs, but we've heard a lot about them. We've seen very detailed spreadsheet of them. But essentially, you're right. Phone A, they're saying the Samsung Galaxy was the one she'd been using for most of that year, that it was active from February, and that phone has never been recovered. It wasn't found when the police did a search warrant on the 5th of August, which is a Saturday after the lunch. The prosecution says that she instead gave them phone B, which was a dummy phone, it says, and that it only had 3 calls listed on that phone, and they were the 3 calls that she made when she was given time to call a lawyer during the execution of that search warrant. So that's phone B with a completely different SIM card in that. If you want to know where the SIM card from phone A went, the prosecution says that that Samsung Galaxy phone was disconnected from the network at exactly the same time that the search warrant was being executed, and that at some stage between that disconnection of the network and the next morning, that SIM card goes into phone C, which is a Nokia, and that Nokia phone has never been found either. So phone A wasn't found, the SIM card wasn't found, and phone C, the Nokia, wasn't found.
We heard this week when Dr. Annette Rogers SC was talking through phone A. Phone A, Dr. Annette Rogers says, the prosecution says, phone A could be what Erin Patterson has used to look up the sightings of death cap mushrooms on our naturalist around the area that she lives, potentially before, and they say allegedly before going and to those sites where they were spotted. As well as that, we heard in Dr. Annette Rogers' closing that a second search warrant executed on Erin Patterson's house in November was basically solely to try and recover phone A.
Yes, and the defence provided a still photo of a video search that was done when the first warrant was executed on the 5th of August. And there's a black rectangular object on a windowsill that the defence has said to the jury, well, they just missed it. That's phone A. That's a phone case. A black phone case. So we heard more about that this week. The defence has made the point that why would you go to all the effort of setting up phone B as a dummy phone if you're Erin Patterson? If you don't know that a search warrant is going to be executed on the Saturday, why would you set up phone B during the week? Why would you do factory resets and start up this new phone? Phone A, Colin Mandy SC says, that's the crucial phone. That's been a usual phone the whole year. So if you're trying to escape blame, why not factory reset that one? And hand that one to police, or why not get rid of it completely. So that was a big point of yesterday, Stocky. Colin Mandy SC said to the jury, if the lunch was this cold, calculated murder that the Crown says Erin committed, that she'd allegedly planned since the 28th of April, and had incriminating searches on her phone, this phone would have either been long gone by the time police knocked on her door on that Saturday, or it would have been factory reset.
Yeah. Rach, as we've had these, the closing statements from the defence and the prosecution laid out this week, and I would encourage you, if you're listening to this and you're keen for some more detail on how, what was presented, what was talked about, go and check out some of our episodes from this week, because we go through each one in a lot of detail. Like Dr. Nat Rogers on Monday and Tuesday, spelling out a huge amount of detail about what they say has happened. Colin Mandy on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday this week, presenting the defence's case as to what's happened, and I'd recommend you go back and have a listen to them, and kind of review the stories and think about the evidence you've heard, and what you think has happened in the cases, as the jury will be doing from next week. But Rachel, what I'm interested in, you've been in the courtroom a number of times this week. As all this is being presented, as Erin Patterson is being told, by two different sides what she's done over the course of the leading up to the lunch, during the lunch, following this lunch that resulted in the deaths of 3 people. How has she been?
Yeah, very different demeanour, Stocky, as you'd expect. So when she's hearing the closing of her lawyer, Colin Mandy SC, at times she became quite upset when certain stories about her children were told, or, the eventual fate of her in-laws, moments like that. But when Dr. Nanette Rogers was giving her closing, it was a very different demeanour. Erin was taking her glasses on and off as certain bits of evidence were raised and making notes at various points.
Yeah. I was in the courtroom yesterday. Yeah, Thursday. And, we've described the layout of this courtroom a couple of times. You've got the judge sitting at the front of the room, kind of bar table where the lawyers sit right in the middle, and then behind them are the seats that the public sit in. And then on the side of the wall, on the side of the room, there's a little bench just inside the door, and I was sitting on the bench. And I was quite close to Ian Wilkinson. So Ian Wilkinson, as I mentioned, is the surviving lunch guest. And, when I'm sitting in the media room and we can see the screen on the wall, it sort of points at the bar table, and Ian Wilkinson's often behind that as well. So I had quite a clear view of him most of this week. And he's been at the court almost every day. I noticed yesterday that he had someone sitting next to him, had their arm around his, sitting close to him yesterday as well when I went into the courtroom. Just sort of kind of like steeling himself through the final moments of this trial. It's been a long time. He's been coming in, I think ever since he gave evidence in that first or second week.
Yeah, and he really has lived and breathed not just the tragedy of the lunch, has he, Stocky, but the aftermath and the trial and the search for answers for all of them.
Yeah. Rach, we've got coming up next week the judge's directions. This is something that we've heard both the prosecution and defence refer to as they've been giving their closing statements. As they're giving their closing statements, they're referring to all this evidence that the jury's been presented with over the last 8 weeks or so, and basically saying at moments, well, look, this bit of evidence, the judge will tell you what weight to put on that when he gives his charge. And that's where we're getting to Tuesday next week, right?
He will. He'll steer them on various issues of law, on the principles of those laws, what weight to give certain evidence. He'll talk through and summarise the main evidence and the arguments, and then they'll be off on deliberations.
Thank you, Rach. We are still getting so many emails from you. We really love to hear from people that are listening to and enjoying Mushroom Case Daily. You can email us mushroomcasedaily@abc.net.au. And we've had a few questions, Rachel, that I want to run through now. I want to start with one from Josh. Josh says, hi, Rachael and Stocky. First, many thanks for your work producing such a gripping and engaging podcast, and an honourable mention to Christian for his work on the pod previously. It's been the perfect mood setter for my pre-dawn dog walks on these chilly Adelaide mornings. His question is, what are your plans for this podcast once the jury retire to deliberate their verdict? With no court proceedings to report on, will we be left in suspense until the verdict has been reached and you can unpack the next steps in the process? Rachel, I might jump onto this one because we have a few episodes we're going to be looking at through that period, basically talking you through how the jury will be, what they'll be doing through that process. Also giving you insight into the way that we've been making the pod through here, working on a few things as well around this. So there'll still be episodes in your feed We do not know how long the jury will be out. Actually leads us very nicely into our next question, Rach. This is from Joe. Joe says, hello, Rachael and Stocky. Greetings from the Shetland Islands. Really enjoying listening to your excellent coverage of this fantastic case. My friends and I discuss it daily, and their question is there a time limit on how long the jury can deliberate before the judge will intervene?
Joe, I've been to the Shetland Islands. It's beautiful, freezing but beautiful. Had lovely whiskey there. I can't tell you, I'm sorry, and I know that I sound like a broken record, but because the jury hasn't heard this, I can't tell you this. So they will be given certain instructions by the judge, and if they have questions, they can come back as they're deliberating with those questions. He can steer them in a certain way. No doubt he might give them an idea about timelines and things like that, but I can't say right now, I'm sorry.
There was a point I thought he said, you take as long as you need. And I, look, I'll be honest.
He did, yeah.
I didn't love that. But, you know, they will take the time that they need to make the decision, and we will be here in Morwell waiting for that so we can bring you the news of a verdict.
He is a very patient man, Justice Beale.
Justice Beale is a very patient man. And, yeah, we'll have you the news and an episode when the verdict is delivered, hanging out in your feed. Final question for not just the Rach, but for the week is from Kath. Greetings from an Aussie listener living in the centre of Ireland. I'm very much enjoying your podcast as you unpack each day of this trial. As you're aware, this case has attracted a lot of international interest. Many of my Irish friends are as intrigued as to why Australia is so fascinated by this case. Any thoughts?
A lot of thoughts on that, Kath. I've had this question so many times from so many people. I can't go anywhere. I can't talk to people at the cafe. I can't go to family gatherings anymore. This is all anyone wants to talk about. And I think it's because it's come from something so normal and mundane, you know, what should have been a wholesome family lunch, people catching up for lunch on a Saturday afternoon. I think it's that. I think it's the elements, the ingredients, shall we say, of this case, the mushrooms and the nature of that.
It's also, I guess, so benign.
That's what I mean, a mundane lunch, you know, that's led to this. And then people always are fascinated about human behaviour. So when they're looking at Erin Patterson and wondering about intent and did she and didn't she, we see this with most of the stories that we cover, Stocky. People want to know what drives people, what makes them tick, what makes them act in a certain way. And I think that feeds into a lot of interest, shall we say, in this case.
Thank you, Rach. Thank you, Kath. I want to do a quick wrap around the grounds. We've got already heard from Kath in Ireland. We've got Joe on the Shetland Islands. I'm going to go through with some in the UK. Rach, we've got Catherine in London, Vera in Newcastle, Liv from Birmingham, Georgina in Chester, Harry in Coventry.
Across the ditch, we've got Joe in Wellington, Vanessa in Wellington, and Emma from Nelson.
We've also got Kiwi Jessica on a holiday in Shiga, Japan. Jason is listening from Sapporo.
Zoe from Einsiedeln in Switzerland. Jackie from Lake Maggiore in Italy.
I googled Lake Maggiore in Italy when Jackie got in touch, and my God, beautiful part of the world.
Stunning. We wish we were there. Have a spritz for us, please, Jackie.
I'm having a pretty good time. But, you know, maybe when we finish up the trial. Laura and our Aussie friend Alex are listening from Portland and Maine in the US. Anna from Kansas City. Andrea from Arizona in the USA.
And Anna on holiday in Sri Lanka.
Thank you so much for all of your emails and just all of your lovely messages. You can get in touch, mushroomcasedaily@abc.net.au. Justice Beale has very kindly given us Monday off next week. Well, I shouldn't say us. He's given the jury Monday off and the lawyers Monday off.
No, it's important we're fresh too. Thank you, Justice Beale.
Oh, look, I don't think we're front of mind, but we will be back in your feed on Tuesday with an episode on the judge's directions, which I'm very excited about. I've never experienced before. It's going to be an entirely new experience for me. So looking forward to absorbing all of that and then appearing in your podcast feed shortly after to relay what has been absorbed by my brain over the course of the day. I would highly recommend jumping onto the ABC Listen app to listen to Mushroom Case Daily as you weave your way into not a legitimate long weekend, but a long weekend away from Mushroom Case Daily. I would encourage you, firstly, to go on and have a listen back to some of the episodes we've produced over the last week. It'll give you a really clear idea of the prosecution and the defence's closing arguments. Also, we've got these weekly wraps that we've done for every week of the trial. So if you don't feel like jumping in and listening to 40-odd episodes of Mushroom Case Daily, you can just listen to 8, and that will bring you up to speed on the broad themes we've heard over this time. And then once you finish that, I would recommend you jump into Trace. It's another wonderful podcast produced by Mushroom Case Daily's very own Rachael Brown. So some weekend listening for you there.
Mushroom Case Daily is produced by ABC Audio Studios and ABC News. It's presented by me, Rachael Brown, and producer Stephen Stockwell.
Our executive producer is Claire Rawlinson. A huge thanks to our true crime colleagues, our commissioning executive producer Tim Roxburgh, and supervising producer Yasmin Parry. Also, shout out to senior lawyer, our legal queen, Jasmine Sims, for her legal advice every single day, and to the Victorian Newsroom and Audio Studios manager, Eric George. This episode was produced on the land of the Gunai-Kurnai people.
Hi, Jules and Jez here, and every week on Not Stupid, we unpack the news of the week.
From the stuff that matters to the stories you're obsessed with.
My friend Lucy has got a moose obsession, and she's really got me right onto it. So you can see on Reddit, there's all these
How does someone develop a moose obsession?
Mate, how does one develop anything in life? You can find Not Stupid on the ABC Listen app.